Welcoming George Monbiot.
What I'm going to propose to you today is a system of very large scale energy replacement, making use of enormous energy grids. That means, I'm afraid, more transmission lines, another thing that I hate, but that appears to be required if we are to have any chance of facing this crisis down. Now let me just give you a brief description of the dimensions of this crisis. It is absolutely imperative that we prevent global temperatures by rising 2 degrees or more above their pre-industrial level. 2 degrees is the point at which various positive feedback processes are triggered off. And positive feedback means a process causing more of the same process. So some classic examples with climate change are that as the ocean warms up, the carbon dioxide dissolves in it, which is dissolved in it, leaves solution and outgasses, as a simple physical property of what happens with dissolved gases in water. As it outgasses, temperatures rise further because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That warms the oceans more. They lose more of their carbon dioxide. As the ice caps melt, an area of the world which was white and therefore very reflective turns dark, turns to sea water, for example, which absorbs much more energy from the sun and therefore heats up more and therefore causes more melting of ice and therefore causes more absorption by the planet of solar radiation, accelerating climate change. In the soils, and this is already happening here in the UK, the metabolic rate of bacteria rises as temperatures increase, which means that they produce more carbon dioxide. In the tropical forests, many forests, particularly in the Amazon, are close to what ecologists call their critical resiliency threshold, the point at which they can no longer cope with rising temperatures. When that happens, the trees start to die back, and trees are basically sticks of wet carbon. As they die back, that carbon oxidizes, it turns into carbon dioxide, and we see greater global temperatures as a result, which causes more trees to die back, etc., etc. Now, some of these processes have begun to an extent to happen already, but full-scale runaway climate change is a certainty with 2 degrees of warming. It now looks as if even 2 degrees might be too much. And certainly one recent paper is talking about the critical tipping point being at about 1.7 degrees of warming, which, when you consider that we've already experienced 0.7 degrees of warming, means we've only got 1 degree to go, and it could happen very quickly. So we have to prevent that point from being reached. And the government, like many governments, has got a plan for preventing this. And they, like me, subscribe to the idea that we need to stop 2 degrees from happening. And in fact, if you look at all the governments in the European Union, apart from the Czech Republic and Poland, and unfortunately, as far as action on climate change is concerned, they're even worse than George Bush. If we look at all the other governments, they all subscribe to this idea of preventing 2 degrees of warming, and they come up with targets for how they're going to do this. The European Union as a whole, plus Sweden and Germany individually, have all said we're going to aim for peaking concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere no greater than 550 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. Well, what does that mean? That means if you put all the greenhouse gases together, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, all the things that we emit into the atmosphere which cause the warming of the planet, and you calculate them as if they were all carbon dioxide, the maximum permissible level would be 550 parts per million. Well, unfortunately, the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change shows that with 550 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere, you don't get 2 degrees of warming, you get very nearly 4 degrees of global warming. And those governments know full well that they're setting the wrong target and yet they persist with that target because the political consequences of going beyond it, they think, are too great. The British government is in a worse position still, because it too has a figure of 550 parts per million, which superficially looks exactly the same as the figure of the European Union and Sweden and Germany. But the British government's figure is for 550 parts per million of carbon dioxide only. Now, when you add up the other greenhouse gases, which generally, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, add an extra 21% or so, that gives us the very appropriate figure of 666 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, that's a formula for between 4 and 5 degrees of warming. And yet they stick with the idea that that's going to lead to no more than 2 degrees. And they know, papers going back 4 years now, government papers, show that they know that it is the wrong target. And I spoke to a very senior figure this summer and said to him, why do you persist with this target, knowing that it is the wrong one? And he said, because if we go any further than that, the Confederation of British Industry will pull out. Now, the CBI is this ridiculously overpowerful organisation within the United Kingdom, and it appears to be holding the government to ransom and basically saying, stick with the wrong target, this target which will not solve the problem, and we will support that as a political programme. Go for the right target which will solve the problem. We will pull out, and what the CBI pulling out means is that the press starts to attack the government, because the media's line and the CBI's line are one and the same. Now, when you look at